Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Live Atom. Live Atom helps businesses grow online by generating more leads. You can learn more by visiting them at liveatom.com. That's liveatom.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Rochester Home Infusion. Rochester Home Infusion provides intravenous medications where it's comfortable and convenient for you in your home, hotel, or temporary residence so that you can get back to living your life. Find out more by visiting them at rochesterhomeinfusion.com or by giving them a call at 507-316-0001. That's 507-316-0001. I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where we amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 157 of the podcast today. We have a very special podcast for you today, the last in our From the Edge podcast series, where we talk about trends in entrepreneurship. Today on the podcast, we were joined by two very intelligent and witty women. The first was Leena Pradhan-Nabzdyk. She's a recent transplant from Boston. She was on faculty at Harvard Medical School for many years. She's an assistant professor of vascular surgery in Boston as well, and she is bringing her genomics business called Canomiks here to Rochester. We're also joined on the podcast today by Nfonoyim Hara. Nicole is also a transplant to Rochester, has been here for the past 4 years, and she's an anthropologist by training. Her specialization is particularly in cultural and visual ethnography, and she got her master's degree at the University of Oxford in immigrant studies. You might know her as the host of Our Town, the show about Rochester, but Nicole is also a writer, especially in nonfiction and essays. So we had a wonderful chat on the podcast today with these two ladies about social innovation, what that looks like in action, and the types of conversations that businesses can have with communities. So don't miss out on this show today. It's one not to miss. So just as a reminder, you can find us, this podcast, through multiple different mechanisms. Of course, it's on our website at rochesterrising.org. We're also on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. So you can check us out on any of those platforms. Just search for us at Rochester Rising. All right, so now on to our final From the Edge podcast with Leena and Nicole. So thanks to both of you for being here today to talk about entrepreneurship, innovation, and whatever else we talk about today. And I'll let you both introduce yourselves.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Leena Pradhan-Nabzdyk. I recently moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Rochester. I followed my husband, who's a consultant at Mayo. In Boston, I have been on faculty membership at Harvard Medical School for about last 14 years. I'm still assistant professor in vascular surgery at Beth Deaconess Medical Center, so I'm doing that job as a part-time job now from here. But at Beth Deaconess, along with two of my very close collaborators, my colleagues, one of who's my supervisor, my mentor, we started a company called Canomiks. And Canomiks provides genomics and bioinformatics services to natural product industry. For example, we can help companies test the quality and the effect of the ingredients that get used. For example, let's say these days CBD is very popular, or turmeric, or ginseng, or green tea, and we can also help them come up with science-based recipes for these formulations. While I was doing this startup, I got really involved in the Boston ecosystem, which is what I would like to talk a little bit about, in addition to the health and well-being space as well.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. As I sip my matcha here, I'm thinking about the work that you're doing and how amazing that is. My name is Nfonoyim Hara, and I am not from Rochester, although I've been here for about 4 years. I came as what I like to call a trailblazing spouse with my husband as well, who brought us here. I'm an anthropologist by training, and so I studied it in undergrad, specializing in cultural and visual ethnography, and then I got a master's at the University of Oxford in immigration studies with a focus on how communities, and particularly cities and the place of the city, can create safe environments for difference to thrive. And so a lot of my work within the anthropology field has been about how social change happens. And I think there's some really interesting and very kind of salient ways in which the work that's being done in innovation, and particularly social innovation, sort of can really energize and really move social change forward on the local level, on the global level. And I'm really excited to talk about that a little bit more. I do a number of different things in the community. Most people know me as the face of Our Town, the show about Rochester, where completely new to me, trying to find something for myself to do here in Rochester. I'm a writer. A lot of that writing happened through the anthropology work I did, so a lot of nonfiction and essays. And then they asked me to be the on-talent sort of face of this show that's a civic affairs show about Rochester. So I get to be on the pulse of a lot of really interesting things that are happening, not only in our entrepreneurship community, but in our arts community, our politics, and seeing how the community is changing as a result of all the things that are going on here.
I think there's certainly a lot of room for social innovation in Rochester right now, so maybe we should start talking about that, and I think it'll transition nicely into Leena's topic.
Yeah. So, social innovation, I think it's not necessarily a current trend. I think it's something that's been part of the conversation, for at least a decade, and some people would say more. I think researchers in the research field and the academic field, it sort of had a lot of traction. I think that where we've sort of been a little unclear about is what it looks like in action, sort of in our communities and within our companies. And, there's... I guess just to kind of like lay a little bit of the clarity, I mean, there's social entrepreneurship, which can look a number of different ways and can be individual entrepreneurs doing and making things for the social good. It could look like those same entrepreneurs and businesses making things, and then also making sure that some of those funds, sort of the philanthropic arm or the corporate social responsibility arm of things are happening. Then there's social enterprise, which for the most part has kind of lived in our nonprofit kind of sector, in our civic sector, where nonprofits are kind of figuring out what it looks like to create and innovate in a way that can provide capital, and then as well as social value. And then social innovation, I think, Stanford and Harvard have really kind of led kind of the charge around how social innovation can really help us think about how to understand the change that we need and how to design for it, which I think sometimes social entrepreneurship and social enterprise may be more about the outcomes and addressing those as opposed to some of the process things that social innovation kind of helps us think through. So yeah, I think that's a good start for me.
So I have a question for you. What excites you most to be in Rochester, and you are really at the cutting edge of social innovation and you have all the background to do that? So what excites you when you go out in the community and talk about the programs that you're interested in? And then what are the challenges that you have faced?
Certainly. One of the things that excites me about Rochester, and I kind of geek out about it as an anthropologist because I'm so interested in community and culture. So sometimes people ask me like, oh my gosh, you're from New York and you've lived in England and you've done all this traveling and you're here and you love it. And I think what really excites me, what has excited me from the beginning, is that we are in a city in the making. And I think that what that engenders is some really interesting galvanization at the grassroots, as much as things are kind of coming down from, the institutional level, whether that be Mayo and its impact in the community, or whether that's a destination medical center. There's some really interesting things happening by everyday people and organizations here, and that's what energizes me quite a bit. And some of that friction that sometimes happen, I think, can be really generative, and I think is necessary for us to be able to do social change in our community. I think it's, I've lived in bigger cities and in, more quote unquote international places. And I think the landscape here seems like it's sort of ripe for that kind of change. And so I think with all of the brainpower that we have here, with all of the capacity, with all of the interest, I think as we, social innovation is really about kind of breaking down those silos, breaking down, those different sectors, really deeply, richly, engaging a cross-sectoral approach. And I think that's something that we have all the tools to do here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always wonder, I completely agree with you. We're going through such rapid change here. And I always wonder about how do you balance, that change with what's here already. And I think that's a struggle for any community, any city. I think I've talked about this on the podcast several times, but it always comes to my mind is I'm from the Pittsburgh area, and with all the medical and technological innovation coming out of University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, it's definitely pushing out residents that grew up there that owned small businesses, and there are some areas that have been completely taken over and no longer are affordable for small businesses that have been there for decades. Right. And it's always, that's the difficult part, is how do you balance those two things? Because it's necessary to move forward, but it's necessary to remember where you came from. I mean, if Pittsburgh remembered where they came from, it would all be steel mills and soot. And obviously that's not where it is now. And, I would say it's changed for the better. So that's always a delicate balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming from Boston, that is one of the biggest issues I find. Boston, as everybody knows, it's now one of the top hubs in the world for innovation, especially anything that is life sciences or anything that is tech. I guess life sciences, it's now number one hub. There are all kinds of numbers out there, but the consistent number I have seen is around 800 or 900 biotech companies in a small size of the city that Boston is. So, which is great. But just what you just talked about is that there has to be a balance, because it's getting very pricey to live in Boston. It's getting very difficult to get entry level talent because of that, and you're constantly competing with the big companies, the big pharmas, because you have a coexistence of the big pharmas, which actually have driven a lot of the innovation and a lot of the startup culture also in Boston. But then at the same time, you have to compete with them. So if somebody can get twice the salary in a big company, how do you lure them to come to work? Because it's unaffordable, if you were to pay them at any other rate. It's kind of hard. So, and again, coming back to the social innovation piece, I think slowly that is really, and as you said, Harvard is one of the top places for social innovation, and so that is all. Stakeholders from that space are also helping navigate companies. How do we make it affordable? How do we make it diverse? And so those are, and so now when I look at Rochester, it's a growing city. It's fun. I'm really excited to be here because there's so much you can do. It's like, an empty space in that sense. And you can paint a portrait, you can paint whatever you want in that sense. And so I'm really excited as I think about maybe moving my company here from Boston. And I constantly think about what was challenging for me in Boston as a startup company, and how can Rochester then help me through that. And that would be one of the reasons I would move the company here, right? And first of all is the access to talent, right? We have the top medical institution in the country here, or maybe in the world here. And so you have access to talent, you have access to really, really smart people. If you have any questions, you can, reach out to people, and I've found that amazing as well. It's very easy to reach out to people and ask for help. I moved here towards the end of July, in August, and I've already met so many really nice, helpful people. So, helping from the perspective of, entrepreneurship, helping from, just an R&D perspective, all of that. So I'm really excited to be here, and, looking forward to, establishing not only my company at some point, but also, my family here.
Leena, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with a lot of the things that you said, and I've also been wondering if you think that communities should be asking businesses that are thinking of relocating or starting in the community some of those questions about those social questions about affordability and kind of you're going to be in a physical space somewhere, what's around that space, how is that going to impact community? Are those conversations that you think we should be inviting businesses to have with community?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm actively looking for a lab space, for example, here. It would be very challenging for me at the stage where my company is to rent out space within Boston. I would have to go probably 20 miles outside of the Boston, Cambridge area, right? But here I can probably be able to afford within 3 to 4 mile radius, right? So, one of the things is, yes, you need critical number of people and talent to run your company, but also those people should be able to live and afford, because in a startup, you can't give corporate benefits and you can't give corporate level salaries, right? So, but what you can give is a big vision. And someday, and I'm hoping, and I know that my company is going to become big. And so, when you try to, you have to look at the whole picture. And it's not just the people who work for you; their families as well, right? So schools become a big issue, right? How far? So nowadays we make this joke in Boston that Boston is an hour away from Boston. I was spending at one point in my life I lived about 13 miles outside of Boston, and I was spending at least an hour each way, right? Yeah. So 2 hours of my life are just gone. I could be spending with my family, I could be spending on my company, I could be just sitting and relaxing. But so those are some of the the absolute plus points of being in a city like Rochester. It's unique in the sense that it's small enough and it's still affordable, but then at the same time it has this wonderful companies, established companies, and not just Rochester. If you look beyond Rochester, just 60 or 70 miles out in Minneapolis, there are all these Fortune 500 companies, right? So that, I mean, like I said, it would take me an hour to get inside the city of Boston, 13 miles. If I go an hour here, drive hour north, I'm in Minneapolis. So, that's a big plus.
Yeah, that certainly puts it into perspective. I wanted to make another comment about, I don't know if we'd fall into social entrepreneurship or social innovation, but definitely seeing like a huge emergence of, I would say, placemaking and social engagement in Rochester. And I think a lot of it is like people realizing they don't need to ask anybody for permission. Like I'm thinking specifically of the really cool mural that was painted on Cafe Steam and Canvas and Chardonnay. And I feel like there's just more of an emergence of these things developing around the castle community that the Rochester Posse is doing, the Rochester Art Heads, My Town, My Music, like really engaging, again, building that culture, that community that you were talking about that is attractive to families, to younger people, people thinking to move their businesses here. And I think that's really, really encouraging that people are just stepping up and doing these things and making a difference and making this a place that they want to be. So that's been really exciting to me over the past, I'd say even like 16 months or so. That's started to happen.
Yeah, I would agree. Like I said, I would agree with that. One of the things that I'm always thinking about, 2 weeks ago, I was one of 8, representatives from Rochester who was chosen to go to this Minnesota Young American Leaders Program, which was Harvard Business School and the University of Minnesota together, bringing in leaders from across Minnesota. And one of the things they mentioned was how Minnesota has been home to a lot of Fortune 500 companies, but the ways in which it has and then hasn't is sort of fallen short in terms of providing for sort of the commons and the public good generally. And so I think sometimes I think we almost need to imbalance that balance that you're talking about so that we focus a little bit more on some of those. So there's such a great landscape here in Rochester where you've got so much innovation happening with new companies, certainly established places like the Mayo Clinic and IBM. And then you have the art spaces that are doing such really interesting work. And then, like you both mentioned, there is and has been and will continue to always be community here. So I'm always thinking about how I know that there's innovation happening, at the corners of our halal shops on the corners of our downtown. I know there's some interesting things happening where communities are helping each other at the neighborhood level, and how do we amplify those? Mm-hmm. And so I think that because I think that will help us all sort of like cross-pollinate, but then also kind of learn how we can better and more deeply engage. Because sometimes I think as much as Rochester can be so helpful and so supportive when you move and you come here, sometimes it's because we're coming in with some of the social capital to understand how to navigate networking or, finding different venues for ourselves or for our families. And I think there are sectors of our population that don't necessarily feel that and may not be able to reap some of those benefits that I think I certainly feel. And so I'm trying to hack my privilege every day to kind of say, how, who's not at the table, how can we engage? And that sort of, not to belabor the social innovation point, I think thinking about all of the wonderful, like, how do we harness all of this like wonderful energy at these sort of top and mid-level like spaces in our community to kind of really feed into the grassroots? And how can the grassroots inform some of that kind of flexibility and that, creativity that sometimes, more rigid, company structures and things like that don't offer. A lot of that does come from my anthropological background in like thinking about social movements and how social movements from the grassroots kind of come up and do work. But I think, we sort of need to dig deeper in our community as well. And I like I said, I think we have the tools to do that, and we're starting to do that. But I think we need to keep it at the forefront of our minds as much as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, as I've always operated under the thought that as far as even our entrepreneurial community goes, it has to all be grassroots. Like, I believe in bottom up, not top down. And the same thing with community. I mean, it is community, just different. This is like a social community,
right, exactly.
But it's interconnected too. But, really understanding what people want and talking with them. And that's a large part of my work now, is trying to make all of these communities that typically didn't have access, whether it was lack of awareness or just lack of someone going out and talking to them and connecting them in, whether it's, even in Rochester, it's hard to get around if you don't have a car and don't have, or you have one for your family. And, if everything's centered downtown, you're really excluding people that, don't gravitate towards traditional organizations. And there's a lot of ideas, a lot of potential out there that's remaining untapped. Even, what is the radius of this city? 5 miles? Yeah. We're not even talking about anything dramatic, but it's a hard task too. It's a hard task to uncover, who those people are, and what they're doing and what they want. But it's exciting though too, because I'm meeting a lot of interesting people that I never met before, and always that passion is very exciting for me. Like, that's what it is for me. If you have a passion, then it's always the team, right? It's always the individual. So it's exciting. It's just also very challenging. But I firmly believe in grassroots efforts for whatever they're working, whatever industry or aim they're working towards.
One of the things that I had talked a lot in Boston in the community, in the entrepreneurial community, was how do we create this pipeline? So I have a very good friend of mine who runs this innovation organization called Venture Cafe in Cambridge. And, she would always talk about there's so much talent in the city. We just, we live in our bubble, but we have to spread out and go and tap into that talent. And when I talk about talent, it starts at a very young age. So how do we develop our young kids? And it could be in whatever field they are interested in, but, how do we get them energized, get them engaged, and get their families, because you have to have a buy-in from the families. So I've always thought about doing something like that. Maybe Nicole, you and I and Amanda, we can, start something like that. I know it's...
Incubate.
Incubator EDU. It's right behind us.
Yeah, right behind us. Yep.
Exactly. So that's such a great idea. I've actually connected with people who are running that, and so I've told them that I would be interested in helping them out whichever way. But I think that's where the cross section of entrepreneurism with social change, and in a city that's where the landscape is changing almost on a daily basis. Every day there is a new crane, a new building going up somewhere, certainly. Right? So there's literal change going on in the city. So I think it's like perfect timing to do all these kind of projects and programs. I'm really excited to be part of that.
And it could also, I think sometimes we think about social problems are so intractable. That's the nature of them. They're these grand problems that are, they're gonna take so many different approaches to kind of solving them. And community, has a lot to kind of figure out, and a lot of issues, and at the local, the national, the global level. And so sometimes I think we think our solutions need to sort of be at that grand level. But I've really appreciated just keeping up with and reading some very simple solutions that local communities have done. One of the ones that had struck me a while ago was Detroit Soup, which was this I guess similar to kind of like a cafe or like a 1 million cups thing, where people come together and they present ideas. There's 4 people each time that present ideas for social change in their community. So I think there's 2 rules. One is that you have to, that it has to be sort of a new thing that you're introducing into the community. It doesn't have to be out like new in the world. And then 2, that it has to be sort of within the city limits of the place, right? So, but people, I think they pay $5 to like have a bowl of soup at this thing. It's a dinner time thing, and then 4 people present on a social innovation that they might be working on, whether that's in social justice, urban environmentalism, the arts, and they just have the opportunity to share that with the community, and then all the money that gets raised that night goes to them, and it's super. I mean, it's super small. You can imagine, but it starts creating a culture about having different conversations about what it means to do change in our community, what it means to be innovative, because sometimes I think those conversations can kind of stay in that sort of shiny, like, bubble of, very sexy bubble of, what companies and startups are doing, but what does that look like, again, at that grassroots level. And so some of that just begins really small. I'm a really big believer in sort of those small steps that you take. And sometimes the role that either more established companies or places even like Collider might have in just being conveners. So it doesn't even need to be, that you need to actually do something or recreate the wheel, but the power that, established entities in our community have to be able to just convene because they have the networks and the capabilities to do that, I think is important.
Yeah. And another of my pet peeve topic is around women in entrepreneurship, women in healthcare, women in tech, and it's very challenging. As a woman in tech and in life sciences, I can tell you that it's. A lot of times you go to a lot of the events and you see mostly men or on panels. It's slowly changing. Nowadays, a lot of panels try to get at least one woman, but I think that needs to change. And one of the things that I have talked about is families. And how, if you have an event, for example, in the evening, and it's an event that I absolutely want to attend because somebody from my field is going to be presenting there, or I want to make connections and network. And then what do you do with if your spouse is also working? What do you do with your children? So one of the things that I've always thought about is, creating maybe pop-up childcares at entrepreneurial events so more women can attend. We see some of those things happening in clinical conferences, etc. But I think, again, I'm just, thinking just from, what all the problems that I've seen in Boston, how can we make that different here as we grow? And some of these things need to be addressed right at the beginning. Recently, I spoke to a group of women from Mayo Clinic who are interested in on entrepreneurship, and there's a lot of interest, and a lot of these questions keep coming up. So how do you manage your time? How do you take care of your family? When do you, and as I mentioned, I have 2 jobs right now because I'm still on faculty and I'm doing my startup as well. But you have to have a supportive family. You have to have a whole tribe. So it again goes into this whole social system and how can we help out each other, and especially women who want to start companies and be in tech and be in high tech. And those are some of the things that I guess Minnesota, which is very family focused, I'm sure it's going to get it right.
Yeah, I hope so. But I think exactly like you said, that's a barrier as well. If there's no childhood, that's a barrier to or no child care provided, because that's, it's excluding people who don't have that ability. So I think that's an easy one to solve, though.
I think you're right.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I'm a newish mom, and it was so I have to apologize to all my friends before I had my baby, and how I had no idea. There was nothing could have prepared me. But as someone who has multiple roles in my job, in my community, and is trying to be active and engaged, that childcare thing is a big thing. We have a shortage of it here in Minnesota, and in the local community, and then even just thinking, I mean, that cultural it does require a cultural shift. I think it's something that we don't think about. Somehow we're expected to sort of check our personal family lives at the door, when we enter into our professional spaces and wanting to work on our career, as opposed to really thinking about those integrated. And I think we play a little bit of lip service. And sometimes I think as women, we may even ourselves sort of downplay that role and not try to center it because, I think because historically it hasn't been good to center that part of our lives. But it's something I've thought about quite a bit. There's some, there's the pop-up idea. I know there's co-working spaces that offer similar, things, more focused to women entrepreneurs and the needs that they might have if they have children, raising young families. And so just some of those, it is about the social innovation part of it, because it is about asking, how do we make this more accessible? How do we get people so that, we're trying to address this barrier that's keeping a whole sector of our, population of talent from being able to participate in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll leave you with one final question before we wrap up here, but that maybe brings both of these together. We were talking about clustering, Leena, before we started talking today, whether it's, having all your resources for business development, let's say in one location, or within a walkable distance. So is that attractive to people looking to start things? And then should you add that social component where you live, work, and play in one spot? So is that, in your opinions, is that a value? Does that overly complicate things? What are your thoughts about that?
For a startup, it's absolutely adds a lot of value, because if you think about it, you're doing so many things and you're doing everything, right? And if something can save you time, because time you cannot buy, right? Once it's gone, yeah. So time is really important, and so anything that will save you time helps. Clustering in the sense that, you don't have to have physically everything in absolute one place, but within walking distance, or, if I'm thinking about setting up my lab, for example, right? I don't want to go too far out because it's cheaper. Because at the stage that my company is in, I may have to quickly go over to the Mayo Clinic, talk to some expert, and then come back, right? And so I think depends on what stage your company is in. If you are, if you already have 100 employees, obviously you can't be in downtown Rochester. But if you are at 5 or 10 employee stage, or maybe even 5 employee stage, I think having everything, all the resources within walking distance is always helpful physically. But, nowadays, think about it. I'm working my 2 jobs essentially for Boston from here. So with all the capabilities on the internet and, long distance communications, it's still possible to do a lot of things long distance. But I think at some point you need the face-to-face as well. And I think for startups, it's good to be close to the experts in the field. It's good to be close to your lawyers, for example. It's good to be close to your accountants, for example. And so I think the clustering is good for a startup, and then as companies grow, then they can decide where they want to put their brick and mortar, especially in the life sciences space. I don't know your thoughts, Nicole.
Yeah, you're much more familiar with that. I think. I think more hybrid models are good. I think you're absolutely right. I think when there's sort of the life cycle of a company, and so you'll need different things. As I'm thinking about what the implications that might have, physical space is really important and place is really important. And so I think I would like to see more companies ask themselves questions about when they do end up going into a physical space, what is the community that I'm going into? What was here before? What might the implications be? And what might be some ways? I'm not saying don't move into a particular place, if some of the answers to those questions aren't going to be beneficial, quote unquote, to the community, but to say, what are some ways that we could open up, space? What are some ways that we could do some educational things that invite local youth into our space, to do some of the pipeline things that you were talking about? And I think sometimes businesses get plopped into communities and like overnight, and people are like, how did this get here? What is this? And just I think we have such a great opportunity here to not do what other places have done, and to be able to have a really nice, open, collaborative landscape for new businesses, established businesses in our community to kind of, it's an ecosystem. We are a part of an ecosystem. You coming into a community changes it. And so I think continuing to have that two-way conversation across sectors is so important. And then I think that would probably be my 2 cents about that.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's excellent insight. It's, that two-way conversation. And a lot of the time it's just one way and there's no input from the community in that regard. So yeah, I think that was really insightful. All right. Well, we're nearing the end. So I will ask, well, first of all, thanks to both of you for your time today and insightful conversation. And I'll ask you just for any final thoughts, and then where can people find you?
Sure. This was exciting. Very nice to meet you, Nicole, and looking forward to collaborating with both of you on all kinds of different and exciting projects. Where can people find me? So the name of my company is Canomiks, Canomiks. If you can go on the website, just Google Canomiks, and my information is on the website. Or just in case, Leena at Leena at canomiks.com.
Thank you both so much. This was very rejuvenating in the middle of the day, so I appreciate it. Where can people find me? You can see me every week when we're on season on Our Town, show about Rochester, on our local PBS station here. You can go on the website, ksmq.org, and find out a little bit more about that work. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well. My name is Nicole, and my last name is Nfonoyim, N as in Nancy, F as in Frank, Onoyim as in Mary.
Well, thanks so much to both of you for this conversation today. Thanks so much to Leena and Nicole for sharing their insights and having this conversation with us on the podcast today. You can find them through their contact information that we're including in the show notes, so check them out. So if you enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more stories about innovation and entrepreneurship in Rochester on our website at rochesterrising.org and by subscribing to our podcast. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so you can find us there as well. Right, that's a wrap for our podcast today. This is actually the last new podcast of 2019, but we'll have a fun wrap-up podcast next week, so be sure to tune in. We'll see you here next week.